Welcome. I'm James Cameron Dunn Waters, the Laird of Fintry. I died back in 1939, but I'm still here. Though I no longer leave footprints, my spirit will always walk this beloved land. So will my dear old Mrs., my Alice. Mind you, she had it a wee bit easier. She was buried over there on the lawn, surrounded by her roses. I wanted cremation, so they had to take my body to Vancouver. Where my ashes ended up is a big secret. But that's not important. What matters is Alice and I are together again, happy here at Fintry. And we welcome guests. But this is now. We should start at the beginning. Come away now, way, way back. My great-uncle, William Dunn, was a major shareholder in the Glasgow Herald newspaper and a very rich man. He bought land around Fintry. That's just west of Stirling, Scotland. He built a fine Victorian mansion there, Creighton House. He'd never married, so when he died, most of his newspaper shares, his siller and Fintry, went to his nephew, my father, James Coulter Waters. Sadly, my father died just a few months later, so the inheritance passed to my older brother, Alexander Waters. He helped me have a wonderful boyhood, fishing and hunting. I studied at Jesus College, Cambridge, but was more interested in sports than in scholastics. Running, rowing, rugby, and of course fox hunting were far more fun than books. When I was 21, my brother died. So suddenly I was the one with land, money, and a newspaper to supervise. In 1888, I married the love of my life, sweet, gentle Alice Ord. At first we reveled in the life of landed gentry. I took a real interest in our tenant farmers, and I even doubled our property, adding Culcruch and its castle to the estate. But a strange restlessness surged through my veins. The green hills of England beckoned so strongly that in 1901 I sold the holdings in Scotland. A year later we bought Plainch Hall in Church Stretton, South Shropshire. Alice and I both rode to the hounds, fox hunting that is, and I was soon named Master of Foxhounds for the prestigious Shropshire Hunt. Ah, the sound of the hunting horn and cry of the hounds were music to my ears, but again I heard a siren song, big game hunting in faraway places. My friend Earl Grey, then Governor-General of Canada, invited me to hunt with him in BC's Kootenay Valley. There, I heard tales of a big game paradise west of the Selkirk and Monashee Mountains, and then down Okanagan Lake. I thought I'd better check it out. One look was all it took. This was where I was meant to be. The hills reminded me of Scotland, so I named the delta Fintry. Originally I bought 1,174 acres for $22,500, but by the time I died I'd more than doubled that, 2,520 acres, or 1,929 hectares if you prefer. It was a big game hunter's paradise, and hunt I did, with pack horses, a guide, and a few friends. I'd be off in the wilds for weeks at a time, but there were other things to do too. First, I had to build a house for my lady. We'd had enough towering castle-like homes, but Fintry proper would still be impressive. Granite for foundations and walls came from the cliff right here on the delta. All other building materials had to come down Okanagan Lake by stern-wheeler. The furniture, beautiful antiques, came all the way from Britain. At this time, the early 1900s, orchards were being planted all through the valley. I had the Garden of Eden. The delta offered rich soil, and the triple waterfall provided the moisture. I simply had to harness the creek's power. I had a fantastic idea for an irrigation system. Several European engineers said my idea was impossible. I showed them. We buried a network of wood stave, wire-wrapped or cast-iron pipe all over the delta. Then we dammed Shorts Creek above the Middle Falls, piped water across the gorge by, if I do say so myself, an extraordinary suspension bridge system. From there, it was carried down to the delta. Of course, there was terrific water pressure by that time, enough to grind grain, run a sawmill, and channel water through those underground pipes to all the houses, gardens, and orchards. We had running water, while my neighbors were still using pails, pumps, or relying completely on open ditch irrigation. We even had spray irrigation, years and years before anyone else. The crops and gardens were a wonder. I installed a Pelton wheel in the water channel, and we had electricity. Rather amazing for that time and that isolated an area. Oh, by the way, we even had our own private telephone system. If you grew fruit, you had to get it ready for shipping, too. That meant a packing house. I built a large one next to the CPR dock on the tip of the delta, using wood from the estate, cut in our own sawmill. Apple boxes were made with our own wood, too. In the front section, we graded, wrapped, and packed. Apples made the main crop, but there were some stone fruits and crab apples, very popular in those days. If we were holding fruit for a few days, until there was enough to fill a boxcar, it was held in the cooler brick portion at the back. Ah, how different this is now. It used to be a busy place. Stern-wheelers, tugs and private boats, mail, supplies arriving, people coming and going all the time. Even the Herefords left for cattle shows by stern-wheeler. The stern-wheeler was the only reasonable means of travel up and down the Okanagan in the early days. The so-called road along the west side of the lake was an overgrown track, all that remained of the Hudson Bay's Fur Brigade Trail. When World War I stormed over the horizon, loyalty to king and country boiled to the surface. I returned to England and joined the Middlesex Yeomanry. I was 51 at the time, so I wasn't much at the front. Remember, in those days there were very few lorries and trucks. Men had to carry amazing loads, but I was able to help. While hunting, I had designed something I called the Yukon Backpack. The British Army thought it was a great idea, and I spent most of the war demonstrating its use to the tumpers, the men who toted the food, equipment, ammunition. It may well be the grandfather of the backpacks I see campers using today. I was wounded at Gallipoli near the end of the war. While recuperating, I realized how hard it would be for the wounded man to return to England immediately, so I opened a small private rehabilitation hospital in Egypt to give them a chance to get back on their feet first. My dear Alice, who was never very strong, hired a companion while she was in Britain waiting for me. Katie Stewart soon became part of our family. These two ladies ran the little hospital. When we returned to Fintry in 1919, Katie came with us, of course. Soon her brother Geordie joined us as the estate's accountant. The Stewarts shared the manor house with us and became lifelong friends. In fact, they lived at Fintry all the rest of their lives, long after Alice and I were gone. I was a particular man. I expected the best from myself, from what Fintry produced, from the men who worked for me. The two brothers who shared management of the estate weren't pulling their weight, and the Hereford cattle weren't winning enough prizes. So, in 1924, I fired the men, sold the cattle, and found a brand new manager, Angus Gray. He did everything superbly and actually stayed at Fintry until it was sold in 1948. As for the cattle, I turned to the fine Ayrshire dairy cows I'd known as a boy in Scotland. If the Okanagan was good for a Scotsman, it should be good for Scottish cattle, too. Now, if I was going to have the very best Ayrshires, I had to have the finest barn for them. I commissioned an architect, a friend from Cambridge days, who then worked in Vancouver. He designed this rather unusual but work-saving octagonal dairy barn. Since I had running water with lots of pressure, I was even able to put in a cement floor, most unusual at the time. I was also adding a trophy room to the south side of the house, especially so I could have a grotto, just like the one where I bagged my prized Kodiak bear. While the construction was in progress, my dear old missus became seriously ill. It was terrible. We lost her on May 1st. 1924 was a year of change and heartbreak. I had to go on, though, and estate business took me to Vancouver the next month. While there, I was horrified to receive a telegram from Angus Gray. A fire had started in the attic over the kitchen. Not only was there no Alice, there was no house. You can't keep a good Scot down, though, so I started over. The granite walls were still sound, so I rebuilt on the same floor plan. I ordered a carload of new antiques from Britain, and was actually able to move back into the house, with Katie and Geordie for company, in November of the same year. To mark the occasion, I imported a wee dram or two, $5,000 worth, bottled under my own label, Laird of Fintry Rare Scotch Whisky. I missed Alice terribly, and to fill the void, I spent more and more time with the Ayrshires. I wanted the very best, so I imported pure-bred stock from Ayr, Scotland. In 1929, I gave one herd to the University of British Columbia. It was the basis of their dairy operation for many years. I wanted to promote the breed, so I sold another herd to local farmers at very reasonable prices. The third lot I kept at Fintry, and a credit they were. We captured trophies for both the amount and quality of milk these fine animals gave. My Fintry honeysuckle gave more milk than any other Ayrshire in Canada for 2 years running. I gave breeding stock away, too, to calf clubs and farmers' institutes. For example, all through the 1930s, I presented a Fintry heifer to a member of the Ayrshire Calf Club at the Armstrong Fair every year. Some of my animals were sold as far away as China and Japan. In the 30s, I had a road carved out of the cliff. The era of the stern wheeler seemed to be ending, and we had to be able to get ourselves, the fruit, and the dairy products to town. Of course, I had to buy a car. My first was a Maxwell, and the climb up from the Delta made less stalwart souls shiver. An old love became a new passion, curling. I blocked off the mouth of Shorts Creek and flooded the area to make our first rink. With natural ice, we had to play in the early morning hours, so we strung electric lights above the sheet. It wasn't too bad, but I soon built a roofed one-sheet rink near the granary. Ah, it was a grand game. I played from Vernon to Vancouver. They even made me a life member of the Vancouver Curling Club. I was getting lonely, though. On one trip to the coast, I met a bright-eyed young Scottish lass, Margaret Menzies. She was working as a temporary secretary at the Vancouver Hotel. I saw her again on the next trip and asked her to be my new wife. She agreed, but perhaps there were too many years between us, and Fintry too isolated for her. She was never very happy here and spent most of her time in Kelowna. When I remarried, Katie and Geordie moved out of the manor house and made a new home for themselves at Burnside, right by the mouth of the creek. They lived there for the rest of their lives. As long as I was around, I'd stroll over for tea every afternoon. One time, when Margaret was with me at Fintry, I lost my motor launch, and nearly my life. If it hadn't been for Angus Gray's bravery and quick thinking, I'd have burned to death, trapped in the blazing boathouse. It had burst into flames when gas from the boat's engine exploded. Thank goodness Margaret was at the bow of the boat, not the stern. She was able to jump out onto the dock in safety. About this time, I learned I had terminal cancer. What was going to happen to my Fintry? I produced a brochure extolling its virtues as a delightful home and sportsman's paradise in the sunny Okanagan. I offered all the orchards, cattle, equipment, plus buildings and land, except for Burnside and 20 acres, for just $100,000. The trouble was, the Depression was just ending and no one had the money. In the end, I gave the estate to Fairbridge Farm Schools, an English philanthropic organization that gave orphans the chance to get an education, learn the science of agriculture, and make new lives for themselves in the colonies. They did a fine job, and many graduates went on to do wonderful things, but my dream of helping young people, of having Fintry become a full-time school, lasted less than 10 years. World War II made the Atlantic voyage too dangerous for orphans to attempt, and money couldn't be sent from Great Britain to keep the schools running. Fintry was finally sold, and over the years many changes occurred to my beloved estate. I wandered far into the hills in those days. Now, the friends of Fintry are trying to bring my estate back to life. Alice and I have come back, overseeing and trying to help their efforts. We welcome them, and we welcome you to Fintry.